Welcome to In-Silico Trials Real Impact, the In-Silico UK podcast that's revolutionizing the way we think about medical innovation. I'm Professor Alejandro Frangi from the University of Manchester, and I'll be your guide through this fascinating world of In-Silico technologies. In each episode, we'll dive into cutting-edge research and groundbreaking news that are shaping the future of medical product development and regulation. From computational modeling to simulated clinical trials, we are exploring how digital approaches are transforming healthcare, making it safer, more efficient, more equitable, and incredibly precise. So, whether you're a researcher, regulator, a member of the public, or a patient representative, or simply curious about the future of medicine, tune in as we unravel the complex world of in-silico methods and their real-world impact. Get ready to discover how computer-simulated trials are leading to very real breakthroughs in patient care. In-Silico Trials, Real Impact, where algorithms and data are saving lives. Let's begin.
You ever ask for directions, right? And sometimes you get the super simple answer, like just head straight down that road. Easy.
Yeah, the quick version.
Exactly. But then other times, someone gives you like every single tiny turn and landmark.
Oh, yeah. Overwhelming.
Totally. And usually, we want the simple way, don't we? It's just easier to deal with.
Makes sense.
But, it feels like in science these days, things are heading in the opposite direction. So much complexity. Think about protein folding predictions or climate forecasting models.
Mm-hmm. Incredibly complex systems.
Right. So it makes you wonder, is that old principle, Occam's razor, the idea that simpler explanations are better, is that still the best approach for science now?
That's a really central question, actually, especially for anyone trying to, get a handle on how science even works.
Yeah.
Whether you're like diving deep into a new field or you're just curious about the world, this whole tension between simple and complex, it's fundamental.
It really is.
And it's not just some, academic thing. It really does affect how we look at data, how we set up experiments, and, ultimately how we understand everything around us.
Exactly. And that is precisely what we're getting into today. We're going to try and unpack this whole idea of Occam's razor, or, the principle of parsimony in scientific modeling.
Yep.
We found this really fascinating recent paper that takes a fresh look at it, especially now with all the huge leaps in science and tech.
Right. Things have changed a lot.
So our mission today really is to understand, when are simpler models actually good? What are they really useful for? And maybe even what does model parsimony actually mean anyway?
Okay, yeah. So maybe to kick things off, think about testing a new drug.
Okay.
The simplest place to start often is just assuming it doesn't do anything, right?
Yeah.
Until you get really strong proof otherwise.
Yeah. Null hypothesis. Seems sensible.
Like a very intuitive use of simplicity. But what about something like, say, aspirin? We already know it does various things in the body.
Right. Pain relief, blood thinning.
Exactly. So if we're now asking about potential side effects, is it still reasonable to assume, as our starting point, that it has no side effects?
Probably not, I guess, if it does other stuff.
Maybe not, yeah. It might actually be more sensible to kind of expect multiple effects even before we pin them all down.
Ah, okay. That's a really good way to show how what we already know might make us lean towards expecting complexity right from the get-go.
Mm-hmm.
And the paper brings up another really cool example with language. Chomsky's longstanding idea about this small, elegant set of universal grammar rules.
The minimalist program idea, yeah.
Primary influential.
Right. The idea that the simple core could explain basically all human languages. That's a very simple concept in terms of the number of core parts.
Absolutely. Very parsimonious by components, as we'll probably get into. But then you contrast that with, the incredible success recently of large language models, LLMs.
Right. Those things are anything but simple. Exactly. They're these massively complex systems. They learn from just vast amounts of text without having those specific grammar rules built in.
And they produce pretty human-sounding text.
They do. And they're forcing us to think in new ways about how language might actually work, even though their whole design philosophy is, miles away from that simple Chomsky idea. It really sets up the tension we're exploring.
Okay, so let's try and nail down what parsimony actually means when we talk about scientific models, because the paper breaks it down into two different concepts, which I found super helpful.
Yes. That distinction is really key. You've got parsimony by constraints on one hand and parsimony by components on the other.
Okay, let's start with constraints. What's that about?
So parsimony by constraints is all about how much a model can sort of flex or adapt to different patterns in the data A model that's parsimonious this way is less flexible.
Less bendy.
Kind of, yeah. It predicts a narrower, more specific range of outcomes.
Right.
So back to the drug example, saying the drug has no effect,
Hmm.
it's a really constrained prediction.
Right.
It doesn't allow for any other possibility.
Ah, I see. It locks it down.
That's parsimony by constraints right there.
Got it. So it's about limiting how much the model can wiggle to fit the data. And the paper mentioned Bayesian approaches often fit here. How does that work?
Yeah, well, think of Bayesian statistics as a way of updating your beliefs using evidence. Your initial belief, the prior, it acts like a constraint. A strong prior limits how much the model can shift based on new data.
Okay. And how do scientists actually, build this constraint into their models? What are the techniques?
Oh, there are several ways. You could use fewer parameters, fewer knobs to twiddle in the model.
Right.
Or you could choose simpler mathematical relationships between variables, what the paper calls less expressive functional forms.
Like using a straight line instead of a complicated curve to fit points.
Exactly. The straight line is less expressive. It has fewer ways it can bend. Other methods include using those more precise prior beliefs in Bayesian models, like we said, or even aiming for a shorter description lengths for the model, basically, a measure of its coding complexity.
Okay.
Anything, really, that restricts the range of patterns the model can capture or predict.
Okay, that makes sense. Fewer ways for the model to bend to the data. So what about the other type? Parsimony by components. That sounds different.
It is quite different, yeah. Parsimony by components is about the number of, let's say, meaningful ingredients inside the model.
Ingredients, like what?
Could be the number of causes it considers, or the number of different mechanisms it proposes, or just the number of variables it includes. Think about the language example again. Chomsky's idea of universal grammar, just a few core rules explaining everything. That's parsimonious by components, trying to explain a lot with just a few basic building blocks.
So fewer building blocks, more parsimonious in this sense.
Got it. Now, the paper says these two types aren't always totally separate things, right? They can kind of overlap.
Absolutely. They often do align, especially if the components you add can sort of adjust themselves based on the data.
Oh, so?
Well, imagine adding more input variables to a statistical model. That's more components, right? But it also usually makes the model more flexible. It can capture more complex input-output relationships. So components and constraints can be linked there.
Okay.
They also tend to line up when there's just a lot of uncertainty about the components themselves. Like, think about complex climate models. They might include many different mechanisms, some still debated. That inherent uncertainty itself can lead to a wider range of possible predictions, less constraint.
Right. So more potential bits can mean more flexibility overall.
Yeah.
But the paper also mentioned cases where they don't align. Quantum electrodynamics was the example. Yeah, that's a fascinating case of misalignment. QED, as it's called, has, well, a lot of theoretical components, mathematically speaking.
Yeah.
But it makes incredibly precise, incredibly inflexible predictions about particle interactions.
Wow.
So it's complex in its structure, its components, but very, very constrained in what it predicts. It's like a really intricate machine built to do just one very specific job perfectly.
That's a great way to put it. Okay. Now, when scientists are actually building these models, trying to make them parsimonious, they're making choices, right? About what goes in, what stays out.
Oh, constantly. Yeah, they're making judgments all the time. Which factors are important enough to include as components? What kinds of constraints feel reasonable?
And that depends on what they're trying to achieve.
Exactly. They're modeling goals, what they already know or think they know about the phenomenon. It all plays in. And crucially, we have to remember, models are often deliberate oversimplifications.
But they know they're leaving stuff out.
Usually, yes, which leads to this idea of model misspecification. The model just fundamentally can't perfectly capture the real process generating the data, no matter how much data you give it.
Because it's too simple.
Potentially, yes. And the paper makes the point that, generally speaking, less constrained models, the more flexible ones, tend to have a lower risk of being misspecified in this way.
Okay, right. So we've got these two flavors of parsimony. And we know building simpler models involves choices that might lead to, well, missing things. Now let's talk about what we actually want from models. A big one is prediction, right? Predictive accuracy.
Absolutely.
So does being more parsimonious automatically make a model better at predicting things?
Not necessarily. It's really a double-edged sword, according to the paper.
How so?
Well, on the one hand, parsimony can definitely help if your simplifying assumptions are basically correct. If you make good simplifications, you can get predictions that are more robust, especially if your data is noisy. Like the drug example. Again, if most new drugs truly have no effect, starting with that simple no-effect model is actually a pretty reliable prediction strategy. Or in some fields, like predicting criminal recidivism, surprisingly simple models with just a few key factors can sometimes outperform more complex ones.
So parsimony can help cut through the noise if your core idea is right. But what's the other edge of the sword?
The downside comes when those simplifying assumptions are just plain wrong. If you impose constraints that don't match reality, your nice, simple, parsimonious model becomes misspecified. It just can't capture the real structure in the data.
Like the aspirin example, assuming no side effects when there probably are some.
Exactly. You'd miss important stuff. The paper also mentions how, overly simple models used to analyze brain activity can sometimes detect oscillations or patterns that aren't actually there just because the model is too rigid. And in genetics, imposing too simple assumptions about how genes relate can lead to estimates that are way off base. In those cases, a more complex, less constrained model would actually give you a more accurate picture.
This is really pushing back against that standard idea, isn't it? That simpler is always better to avoid overfitting the data.
It is.
Because I always learned, more complex models, more parameters, they just memorize the noise and don't generalize to new data. So maybe for you listening, the takeaway is to question that idea a bit. That complex equals bad, sometimes maybe not.
Exactly. That's the classic bias-variance trade-off picture. Simple models have high bias but low variance. Complex models have low bias but high variance, potentially overfitting.
Right.
But the paper highlights this really fascinating, relatively recent finding called double descent.
Double descent, what's that?
It turns out that if you keep making a model more complex, adding more and more parameters, even way past the point where you have more parameters than data points.
Which sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It sounds like it should be. But often, the prediction error, after going up for a bit, actually starts to go down again.
Seriously?
Yeah, figure 2 in the paper shows it visually. You can end up with these hugely over-parameterized models that somehow achieve both low bias and low variance. And they can be surprisingly robust, even with noisy data.
That's wild. So tons of parameters doesn't automatically kill generalization anymore. How does that even work?
Well, the paper mentions this idea of implicit regularization. It seems the algorithms we use to actually train these giant models have some kind of built-in preference. They somehow steer the model towards solutions that generalize well, even though we didn't explicitly tell the model be simple.
So the training process itself is doing some simplifying.
In a way, yeah. And the fitting procedure itself imposes some hidden constraints, finding surprisingly robust solutions within that huge space of possibilities. So robustness doesn't only come from us deliberately choosing a simple model structure.
Okay, my brain is slightly dead now, so parsimony. Not a silver bullet for prediction. What about another big reason we like simplicity? Just understanding stuff, interpretability. How does parsimony link to that? Surely simpler models are always easier to understand.
Well, it's a bit more nuanced than that. When we talk interpretability, the paper makes a useful distinction between intrinsic and external.
Okay.
Intrinsic interpretability is about understanding the model's own guts, how its parts work together. External interpretability is about what the model tells us about the real-world phenomenon it's supposed to represent.
Gotcha. Inner workings versus real-world insights.
Right. And for interpretability, the paper mostly focuses on parsimony by components, the number of ingredients.
Okay, so fewer ingredients should make it easier to see what's going on inside the model, right? Intrinsic interpretability.
In many situations, yes. Fewer components means it can be easier for us humans, with our limited working memory, to sort of track the relationships, anticipate what the model will do, see how changing one part affects the outcome.
Makes sense. Cognitive limits.
Exactly. The paper gives the example of simple decision tree models being really effective in places like medical triage. They're like flowcharts. People can follow the logic easily, which is crucial when the stakes are high.
Right. Easy to see the path. But you said in many situations, does that mean a simple model can sometimes be hard to interpret internally?
It can, surprisingly. Think about, say, a model with just a few parameters, but the relationship between them is highly nonlinear.
Okay.
That model might be technically simple, component-wise, but it could produce incredibly complex, almost chaotic behavior, making it really hard to get an intuition for what changing a parameter actually does. The paper notes, even simple neural networks, just 2 neurons, can show this. And conversely, some quite complex models can be intrinsically interpretable if they have the right structure. like a sparse model.
Sparse.
Meaning it might have tons of parameters overall, but for any specific input, only a few of them are actually active or non-zero. That can make it easier to trace the connection between input and output than, say, a smaller, denser model where everything is always interconnected and influencing everything else.
So it's not just the number of parts, but how they're wired up. And I guess who's doing the interpreting also matters.
Oh, absolutely. Intrinsic interpretability isn't just about the model. It's about the model and the user. Your prior knowledge, your expertise, your ability to kind of chunk the model or see patterns at a higher level, that all plays a huge role.
Right.
The paper mentioned a complex working memory model. It has thousands of simulated neurons impossible to track individually. But neuroscientists can interpret it at the level of brain regions and their interactions, because that's the level they understand.
This whole interpretability thing is definitely trickier than it sounds. And parsimony by components doesn't guarantee it. Okay, what about the other kind? External interpretability, understanding the world via the model.
Right. So here, the big risk with parsimony is misspecification again.
If the simple model is wrong.
Exactly. If it's too simple and doesn't accurately reflect how things work in the real world, then its components, even if there are only a few and they seem easy to grasp, won't actually give you reliable insights. They might actively mislead you.
Can you give it an example?
The paper has a fun one about predicting Lego set prices based on the age range printed on the box. You might find a simple relationship, sure.
Okay.
But it can be totally misleading if you ignore a much more important factor, like, say, the number of pieces in the set.
Right. The age range might correlate with piece count, but it's not the real driver.
Precisely. So a more complex model that includes the piece count, that mediating variable gives you a much more faithful picture of reality, better external interpretability. Sometimes you just need that complexity to truly represent what's going on.
Right. A simple story isn't helpful if it's the wrong story. Okay, moving on. How do models help scientists actually do science, like guide new research? Is parsimony good for that?
The paper suggests it can be, yeah. Parsimonious models can function as useful reasoning tools. If a model is simple enough to really wrap your head around and tinker with, it can help you generate new hypotheses, think through implications. We call it an intuition pump.
An intuition pump, I like that. Yeah.
And also, just the process of trying to build a simple model can sometimes force you to crystallize your thinking, to focus on what you think are the absolute core features of a phenomenon. That process itself can spark new research questions.
So simplicity can help clarify thinking and maybe point in new directions.
Yeah.
Are there downsides to relying on simple models to guide research, though?
There can be, yes. The paper flags the potential for biases. For instance, if you're always starting with highly constrained, simple models, your research might naturally fall into a pattern of just testing narrow, sequential hypotheses one after the other.
Kind of incremental.
Right. And while people used to think simple component models help find general principles across fields, that's being questioned now. Sometimes focusing too much on these simple models can lead research to become really fragmented.
Fragmented how?
Like studying isolated little toy problems in very controlled lab settings instead of trying to build bigger, more integrated pictures of complex things. Think about psychology. You might have separate, simple models for attention, perception, memory, categorization.
But maybe they don't connect up easily to explain real-world behavior.
Exactly. It can lead to a collection of neat little models that don't really talk to each other. Contrast that with more integrative approaches like building complex cognitive architectures or using things like large language models, which try to capture more context.
That makes sense. You could end up with lots of pieces, but no puzzle picture. And what if those simple guiding models are just wrong, like misspecified?
Well, that's a major risk. If your guiding model is fundamentally flawed, you're essentially biasing your whole experimental process based on a false premise.
Asking the wrong questions.
Or looking for effects that aren't there, or missing ones that are. The paper even cites this really striking computational study.
Yeah.
They simulated doing experiments, and in some situations, doing experiments randomly actually led them to discover better models than trying to do experiments guided by plausible but ultimately incorrect simple theories.
Wow. Randomness beat theory.
In that specific case where the simple theory was misleading, yes. It just shows how much a misspecified parsimonious model can potentially send scientists down unproductive paths, wasting time and resources.
That's a pretty powerful counterargument to just blindly chasing simplicity. Okay, another practical thing. Resources, time, money, computing power. Are parsimonious models always the winners there? More efficient?
Traditionally, that's been a big argument for them, yes. Simpler models generally need less data to fit, less computing time to train, less memory, less energy.
Right. Think about the environmental cost of training some of those huge AI models.
Exactly. That's a real cost associated with complexity. Plus, some beautifully simple models, like, say, the drift diffusion model in decision-making, have analytical solutions.
Yeah.
You can literally solve them with math, which is incredibly efficient compared to running massive simulations for a complex model.
Okay, so simple can mean cheaper and faster, but is it always that way?
Yeah.
Can complex models ever be more efficient?
Interestingly, yes, sometimes. The paper points out a couple of twists. One is that, counterintuitively, sometimes making a model less parsimonious, maybe by adding parameters, can actually make it computationally easier to find a good solution during training.
Huh, more parameters makes it easier to train. Oh.
It's complex, but sometimes adding parameters smooths out the landscape the training algorithm is searching, making it easier to find a good minimum. Also, think about complex machine learning models replacing older, maybe parsimonious but computationally slow models.
Like what?
Well, they mentioned using a neural network to very quickly approximate the results of a complex but analytically very slow model used in chemistry. The neural net is complex but way faster to run.
Ah, like an emulator.
Exactly. And even in terms of using models after they're trained, complexity doesn't always mean inefficiency. Those emulator models are one example. Or think about complex neural nets that are designed to be sparse.
Right, where only parts light up.
Yeah. Or models with gating mechanisms that only activate relevant parts for a given task. These can be very complex overall, but surprisingly efficient to actually run for a specific prediction.
So again, the parsimony efficiency link isn't straightforward. Depends on the specifics. What about when you just don't have much data? Limited data scenarios. Is that when parsimony is absolutely essential?
That's definitely the classic wisdom. When you have small data sets or noisy data, or you're studying things you can only measure indirectly, like in biology often, the standard advice is keep it simple. Fewer parameters, strong constraints. Because every extra bit you add that isn't strongly supported by data just makes it easier to fit noise or get unreliable results. Training gets much harder.
Makes perfect sense. Don't try to build a skyscraper on a tiny foundation. But does the paper push back on this too?
A little, yeah. It circles back to those complex but constrained models and the double descent idea.
Right. The idea that sometimes very complex models can work with limited data.
Exactly. It suggests that having more parameters than data points isn't automatically fatal, especially if there's implicit regularization happening. And also when you're dealing with systems where key parts are just unobservable.
Like inner workings of a cell or deep climate processes?
Right. Instead of desperately trying to find the one true simple model that fits your limited indirect data, the paper suggests maybe a more honest approach is pluralism.
Pluralism, meaning?
Using an ensemble. A collection of different plausible models, like they do in climate science, running simulations from many different models that make different simplifying assumptions. You acknowledge the uncertainty instead of forcing a single, potentially wrong, simple answer.
So embrace the uncertainty with multiple viewpoints rather than forcing one simple one.
Interesting. Okay, last big area the paper touches on. Our basic assumptions about the world itself. Does thinking the world is simple make us prefer simple models?
It seems likely, yeah. There's long philosophical and scientific tradition arguing that nature itself prefers simplicity, elegance. Think Copernicus arguing for the heliocentric model, partly because it seems simpler, more elegant than Ptolemy's complex system.
Right, less clutter.
Even today, in fields like psychology or medicine, there's often this built-in assumption, the null hypothesis, that a new intervention is more likely to do nothing. That biases things towards starting with parsimonious no-effect models.
So our underlying beliefs about reality definitely shape our modeling preferences, but what if reality is just messy and complex? Well, that's where things get tricky. There's a growing appreciation in basically all fields, neuroscience, ecology, social sciences, of just how interconnected and complex things really are. Temporal dynamics, spatial patterns, context dependency.
Yeah, everything affects everything else.
Pretty much. So in those cases, trying to impose a very simple parsimonious model that deliberately ignores all that context and interaction, well, it's just not going to be a good representation of reality, is it?
Seems unlikely.
And the paper also notes this interesting mismatch sometimes. Scientists might believe a system is fundamentally complex, even if the available data looks simple superficially, or vice versa.
Like what?
Think about natural selection, a relatively simple mechanism, arguably producing the incredible complexity of life. Or Chomsky's idea again. a simple underlying grammar generating the infinite richness of language. So our beliefs about the simplicity or complexity of the underlying reality don't always map neatly onto the models we find most useful.
Okay, wow. We have covered a ton of ground here. So let's try and boil it down. What's the big takeaway message about Occam's razor in science today? Still sharp or getting a bit rusty?
I think the main thrust of the paper is that parsimony is definitely not some universal ironclad rule anymore. Whether it's useful, whether simplicity is good, it really depends.
Depends on what?
On your goals. What are you trying to do with the model? Predict. Understand. Guide experiments. It depends on the specific context, the data you have. And it depends on which kind of parsimony you're even talking about, constraints or components.
Right.
So yeah, both simplicity and complexity have their roles. They're maybe better seen as complementary tools in the scientific toolkit, not opposing philosophies where one has to win.
That feels right. Not either. Okay, so looking ahead, where does this leave us? Is the balance shifting?
The paper hints at some interesting directions. One idea is shifting focus from the parsimony of the model itself to the parsimony of the whole modeling process, including training, data collection, everything.
The overall effort involved.
Yeah. And another really intriguing strategy they highlight is almost flipping the traditional approach. Instead of starting simple, maybe sometimes we should start with deliberately complex, highly flexible models, especially when we don't know much yet.
Start complex. Why?
To really let the data speak, to uncover whatever hidden structure might be there without imposing too many preconceived notions. Then, once that complex model has hopefully captured the important patterns, you can try to distill it.
Distill it.
Yeah, compress it, simplify it down into a more parsimonious account that captures the essence of what the complex model learned, for easier understanding or communication or faster application. They mention the Moral Machine Project, using complex AI to refine simpler theories of human moral judgment, as an example.
That is a fascinating reversal. Start big, then shrink. Okay, so maybe a final thought to leave everyone mulling over. If our whole understanding of simplicity and complexity in science is changing like this, what kind of weird, surprising new ways of building knowledge might pop up in the future? How do you think this balance might shift in fields you're interested in, or just science overall? It really does feel like maybe Occam's famous razor needs, maybe not replacing, but definitely some careful reevaluation.
A thoughtful recalibration, perhaps.
Exactly. Lots to think about there.